Welcome to part 3. At this point, let's go back and address the issue of allowing people to buy land instead of renting. Could we have set up Desert Island Land Sales Limited, with the proceeds of the sales being distributed to other islanders as dividends? There may be some systems for enabling this to happen in a fair way, but the system would have to avoid some tricky problems. If people were allowed to buy land, and also to privately rent their land to other people, and you allowed people to pass down their land to their children, then, after a few generations, you risk ending up in the same state as we are in today, with poor non-landowners paying a lifetime's rent to rich landlords based on what was agreed amongst their distant ancestors. Those poor people paying the rent will have been born too late to have received any of the original purchase money. Another way to look at what happens with the purchasing of land is to consider what happens in the years that follow the purchase. On day 1, all the other islanders will receive payment from the purchaser, so it appears that the selling of this plot has worked out perfectly fairly. But what happens as the decades roll by? Let's say that the owner dies and passes the land to his or her children. Now it's, say, 100 years after the original purchase. The island will now be populated entirely by people that never received any payment for the land, and yet they are still foregoing their right to use it. Over the period of a typical lifetime, say 80 or 90 years, the state of ownership will gradually transition from perfectly fair and equitable to entirely unjust. I'm not saying that there's no possibility of land ownership, simply that if it is to be allowed, then additional mechanisms may need to be put in place to avoid a gradual decline into injustice. Perhaps limits on ownership duration, or restrictions on handing down land to relatives, or special land taxes, that sort of thing. Now I wish to address another issue that makes it just that bit harder to resolve the injustice of land theft. We need to consider things that go on the land. Let us first consider caravans. If someone goes to the trouble of constructing a caravan, that caravan should belong exclusively to them. There is no reason to say that any other islanders should have a stake in the caravan. If the person that made it sold it to someone else, then the purchaser alone can own it forevermore, or give it to their children. It's all perfectly fair. But now what happens if we imagine that the caravan had no wheels, and was in fact made of stone? You can see where I'm going here. The caravan has become a house, and it's impossible to move. Now we run into a contradiction. We have a bricks and mortar thing called a house, which, considered by itself, can be purchased to own forever. But it's sitting on land, which you should only be allowed to live on so long as you're paying the rent. This contradiction leads to a few tricky problems. For example, say the owner of the house wants to sell up and move. Then the selling process is now kind of 2 auctions at the same time. The house owner wants to find the person willing to pay the highest price for the bricks and mortar, whilst the landowner, that's Desert Island Land Rental Limited, wants to find the person willing to pay the highest rent for the land. These may of course be 2 different people. How are we going to sort that out? A variety of economists have devised mechanisms for resolving exactly this issue. These mechanisms aim to derive a formula to establish the correct rent, so that when someone wishes to move home, we end up with just a single auction purely for the price of the house. These rent estimation mechanisms are a bit too complicated to explain in this short video, and they are not without their critics. Some people are keen to claim that this simultaneous renting and purchasing dilemma is so difficult to resolve that you may as well give up and stick to the current system. This guy, for example. But even if the solutions are not perfect, they would still be substantially fairer than what we have now. So there we have an outline of the issues involved in land ownership, and how it could be done in a fairer way. But how to make the transition from our current system to a fairer one is probably the hardest problem of them all. Doing it abruptly could easily cause a whole load of new injustices in the process. It may be fairest to make a gradual transition over a period of decades. In the description I will list some organizations that are campaigning on these issues. Check them out.